Welcome to the Church Resource, where we talk about the best resources for pastors, leaders, and lay people. I'm your host, Jeff Oliver. Today's book is called The First 100 Days by T. Scott Daniels. It's called A Pastor's Guide. It is rightly named because Daniels comes with a wealth of real life in the church, in the office, in the pulpit experience with being a church leader, being a pastor. And he is, I think, he does an incredible job of doing this in a relatively small space, in a shorter book that is very easy to read. He provides lots of illustrations in here that are going to be relevant to almost anybody who's stepping into a position, especially in a senior pastor position, or as the only pastor in some smaller church settings. It's one that I stepped into, and really not knowing what to do next or first even. And as Daniels lays all of these things out, and it's almost you could go through it as almost a checklist. There's not a 1 through 50 things that you need to do in this order, but he does come to it with a lot of wisdom, again, a lot of experience, and this seems trite, but I have to say it's just one of the books that I wish I had had when I started in my ministry, and it's one that you should go to. Now, if you're not in that position of thinking, well, I'm going to be stepping into a missions, rather a ministry context, and I've already started it, or I've already been a pastor for X number of years, or I'm not even a pastor at all. I've just, I'm a church member or some other church leader who's maybe an unpaid leader who is just involved in the ministry of my church, and I just want to be a good help to my pastor. That should be anybody's desire. If they're not the pastor, they should want to be a help to the pastor and support the work that's being done there, as long as it's being done in the name of the Lord and in the ways that are honoring to God, any godly means possible to do the work of the church that the pastor's been sent there to do. So I will go through some of the key points of the book, and again, not to give it away, but to be able to show you and tell you that this is a book that you should have definitely, that was going to be something that's going to be just so helpful for you as you go through it. And even if you've gone through it once, I found it helpful once I did come across this book, and once I was in a place of ministry, having been there for a couple of years at that point, to go back through and say, well, this is something I can fine-tune, this is something I can tweak, and wow, that's something I shouldn't have done at all. But it's again, very helpful. One thing I'll point out, too, before I get into the meat of the book, is that Daniels comes from let's say, a different denominational background than I would, so just recognize that. He does talk about women being involved as pastors, and he speaks, he uses male and female as pastors, and so that's different from my experience and my tradition. It is he also comes, is going to have some differences there in church polity and how churches are set up, whether you have just pastors or elders or deacons or some combination of those, and what the church structure would be like, and how you're called to a church, whether in some traditions that they would be called by the larger by the denomination to go to this church, whereas where I have camped out for most of my career in life really is that in more Southern Baptist tradition, that you are a freelance agent and you can just go to to a church and apply there to determine a sense of calling. Now, he talks about this idea of calling, and this is very important language as you look at the role of the pastor, that this is not that the church is hiring you, and no matter what tradition you're coming from, they could use that term that we hired a new pastor. That's not the right language to use, and he makes this very clear and says, that's vital language to be able to use to change that, because this is a calling that you've stepped into. You have been invited to come in to another group's, into another family's family tradition, into their family reunion, and you've been invited to step into there. And so kind of really tread lightly. I mean, you're in a place of leadership. You're in a place of really where they're going to look to you to call the shots, but to go in carefully and slowly sometimes. But again, this book is called The First 100 Days. That's considered the kind of the peak or the test of what a new president's going to be. For example, what does he do in his first 100 days? And that's the perspective that Daniels comes from in writing this book about pastors. Now, the contents of it is going to be so obvious what kinds of things he talks about, and I just like the way he's named some of the chapters, like know what you don't know, and also to establish clear expectations. He reminds us to preach well, to secure some early wins, to take care of yourself. Those are just some chapter titles that I picked out there to show you examples of what kinds of things he's talking about here in this book. Again, a very helpful book. One thing that I like he points out here is that you need to become a historian of not only your church and the people involved in that church, but also the community at large, and what kinds of things they've seen out of that church, out of pastors who have come and gone, and what kind of impact the church has had, whether it's positive or negative or some combination of that, what previous pastors have done, even what some previous church members have done within that church, and to kind of set the personality of that particular church. I've understood that as you go into a church, that every church, just like every family that you would meet, but certainly every church is its own particular culture. And this is a culture that's been nurtured, that's been affected, that's been changed and been refined, you might say, over the years. And so this is something that a new pastor is not going to be able to come in and radically change something within the first month, the first years even, but something that needs to take some patience, but also, again, that some groundwork needs to be laid. And that's the point of this first 100 days that he talks about here. So we are realizing again that we're invited, and here's where he says it, that we're invited into someone else's family reunion, that new pastors should consider themselves as the ones invited to attend and coordinate the reunion, but they aren't family yet. And so just kind of observe, recognize some of the patterns, some of the people and personalities that you'll be taking a look at and working with in the context of serving in this church, serving these people in this church for God's glory. He talks about that even one thing that you can do in the beginning of a church ministry position is that you could have kind of a dinner maybe, and that it would be a congregational history-telling event that you call in because these are your experts, the people who have been in the church, whether they've been in a day longer than you or decades longer than you. They know what this church is about, and they're going to have some perspective there that you don't. And so call on people to talk about that and to really tell what their experiences have been in this church, what the impact has been, what certain pastors have done to affect their lives, to improve their walk with Jesus. And so I thought that was a great idea. Also, he just lays out some of the questions that you can ask here in that particular setting, in that context, for that kind of history lesson as you ask and enlist, really involve the church people to do that. There's another set of questions here that he says that are kind of understanding the mission of the church. Very important that you be able to do that and see what the heart of the people is for this church. Where is our place in the community, and what is the impact that we want to make as it relates to our church and the people we have here, the resources that we have. And so some of the questions: what do people consider to be the church's greatest strength? What impact does the church have currently on the community? What role does the church see the pastor fulfilling? By the way, if you are in the place of being able to pick up this book before you step into a ministry context, and even in this case, to be able to look at it before you even look into seeing what churches you want to talk to, and who you want to align yourself with here as you go as maybe a pastoral candidate. These are some great questions ask here, to be able to ask those people on the, say, the pastor search committee. That's my experience with this kind of setting. But if you wanted to ask those kinds of questions about the church and about previous pastors and what the church believes, what their philosophy is about the pastor's, say, availability or his gift mix, what kinds of things they would expect for their pastor to do, what's the expectation in terms of ministry visits and hospital visits and all of those things. And so that's going to help you to understand who these people are as you seek to minister to them in this church. So very good questions to be able to ask and to have in your arsenal as you try to understand who these people are and how to best lead them. Well, he talks about it being so important for a pastor to understand a church's finances from day one, really, to understand, it's up to you, really. He points this out, that you may want to be able to know who gives and how much and those kinds of things. I know of churches that the pastor has very specific knowledge of those things. And some pastors say, I don't even want to know, just want to know that our budgets are being met, our goals are being met, and how much maybe we have in reserve and those kinds of things generally. But whether you choose to know all about it or some about it, you need to know where the church sits financially and what you might be stepping into as the pastor. Now, I appreciate that this author, Daniels, explains that his wife laughed at a couple of things as she looked at the script, at the transcript for his book, as he's written all this out, that he said she kind of chuckled. And one of those chapters that she kind of questioned, that she made raise an eyebrow at, was to help your family transition. Another of those kind of questionable chapters in her mind, and as she talked to her husband, the author of this book, about, was that we should, as a pastor, as a church leader, take care of yourself. And she kind of smiled about those, because those are areas in which this pastor turned author of this book maybe didn't do so well at it. So he comes with that experience of having made the mistake, or mistakes maybe, in his family and in his own self-care, to maybe better understand and then be able to tell other aspiring pastors or pastors in transition then how to do that. So he does talk about helping your family transition, and that some of the things that he even says that if I had it to do over, here's what I would do. So thank God that he had those challenges and came through those difficulties, because he was able to use those things as God does, right? That he would use all of our circumstances then to be able to for good, for being able to help us and to help others in their setting. So he says, just generally in this, I won't do the whole chapter for you, but just to give you an outline of this idea of helping your family transition, that you need to involve the whole family in the decision-making process, what the area is like, and listen to your wife and your children, Pastor, about whether we should be in this area, what the schools are like, what the general feel and personality of the community is like. Do you feel good as you drive into the place, or does it kind of give you some ominous feelings? I know that my children felt that way about some communities that we drove through and drove into to see a particular church, and it just felt like it wasn't the right place, and that I think we have to recognize that the Holy Spirit works through their lives and their hearts as much as they would in ours, in a sense of calling. So secondly, he says, take some time for a transition break in between ministry assignments. If that's possible at all, he recommends something like a month at least to be able to do that, to be able to move from one context to the other, have that time there as a buffer, to be able to kind of get back in touch with your family, to get some time together, and then recognizing that as you do step into that new role, that we're going to have maybe some limited time. And so it's going to be important that you have that time set aside for your wife and your children. Thirdly, he says, work hard to make sure that your family feels plugged in into the new church, because you're not only choosing a place where you will serve, Pastor, but you are choosing a place where your wife is going to serve probably right alongside you and serve in many different roles within the church, and where your children will fit in. And you're choosing a new church for them to be a part of and for them to join that family in the church. I know that when I was pastoring, my children all the way down to age 2 were at the front door handing out bulletins and saying hi, just smiling to people as they came in. So your family, your whole family is going to be involved in doing ministry. And so just make sure that it's a place that they appreciate and that they can fit in where they, as it's said, where they fit and where they're fed. Also, lastly, one of the last things I'll mention here is that he says to get a list as you go into a new church, into this new setting, that you might get a list of the people who are currently in the hospital, maybe people who are in nursing homes nearby who have been a part of your church, people who are homebound and shut in the church, in church life, and that you can get an opportunity to visit all of those people, to make contact with them, and to really be the pastor of the whole church, and to take those responsibilities carefully and take them seriously. That you can really, as he says, what that will serve to do is to give you some quick wins in terms of the rest of the church, just to know that you are diligent from the very active. And of course, it's easier to reach out to those who are very active in your church and working alongside you, but those who maybe have been marginalized for a while, those who have not been present and not as obvious and not as visible in the church, but to be able to do that is so important. He does say that you need to take care of yourself, that you need to make sure that you're working on your own spiritual life, that you're working on getting rest, and as you would advise anybody else to do in their setting, in their context, whether it's a job or ministry service, that you would advise other people to do that. So certainly you need to make sure that you're doing that yourself. As an epilogue, Daniels gives the importance that he says, really, this is not to be forgotten, but I think he doesn't want to get out of this book that is otherwise very, and not that this isn't practical, but I'll get to that in a minute, but it's very pragmatic and almost, again, a step-by-step things to do, not to do, some suggestions, some lists of questions and things to think about. But he says, do not forget the idea why you're there is to lead other people to God, and to be able to do that from a rich, from a meaningful relationship that you already have with God, and then to be able to help others and minister to them, that your prayer life is crucial, that your time in the Word, outside of prepping for another teaching or another preaching opportunity, but just for your own edification, that's so important. Don't forget why you're there, and don't forget the power of the Holy Spirit to work within you to accomplish what you need to do. Highly recommending Daniels, T. Scott Daniels, The First 100 Days, A Pastor's Guide. It's something that I think you need to have. It's just one book from my shelves that's been helpful to me in my ministry, and I hope this gives you a bit of direction as you prayerfully consider which resources will best help you and the people you minister to. Well, thanks for listening to The Church Resource. Please make sure that you give us a review. If you have any suggestions of resources you would like us to look at, email us at thechurchresource@gmail.com. That's thechurchresource@gmail.com.